This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. What if comparing car insurance rates was as easy as putting on your favorite podcast? With Progressive, it is. Just visit the Progressive website to quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's direct rate, then their tool will provide options from other companies so you can compare. All you need to do is choose the rate and coverage you like. Quote today at Progressive.com to join the more than 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Have you ever thought, ugh, this water is too wet?
Or this beach is too sandy? My name's Christine.
And my name is Zandy.
And we're the hosts of Beach Too Sandy, Water Too Wet, a podcast where we do dramatic readings of the most wild and off-the-wall reviews on the internet.
We find the funniest, real reviews about everything from Vegas weddings, matchmaking services and Trader Joe's, to caves, toddler beds, and Spirit Halloween.
You won't believe the things that people think absolutely must be said on the internet. How else would everyone know that some caves don't have Wi-Fi?
We hear about the good, the bad, and that one time Spirit Halloween sent someone a dildo instead of a Halloween costume. And believe it or not, we got to the bottom of it.
Join us every Wednesday wherever you listen to your podcasts. Beach Too Sandy, Water Too Wet is brought to you by the Forever Dog Podcast Network.
The following podcast contains explicit language. Hide your children. Hi, I'm Josh Levin, and this is Hang Up and Listen for the week of April 17th, 2023. On this week's show, Defector's Patrick Redford will join us to talk about what it felt and sounded like inside the arena as the Sacramento Kings won the franchise's first playoff game in 17 years. Another Defectorite, Dave McKenna, will be here to mourn or perhaps celebrate the end of Dan Snyder's ownership of the Washington Commanders. And finally, Sports Illustrated's John Wertheim will come on for a conversation about the WTA's decision to return to China and whether women's tennis is choosing profit over principle. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of The Queen and the host of the podcast 1 Year. Also in D.C. is Stefan Fatsis. He is the author of the books Word Freak, A Few Seconds of Panic, and Wild and Outside. Hello, Stefan.
Hey, Josh. So I did not hear from anyone who lived at 620 Eli Avenue, where John McGraw and his wife Blanche moved after living the previous decade in my house at 915 Edgewood Avenue in Pelham, New York. But I did hear from someone who attended a pre-prom party at 620 Eli Avenue a few years before I graduated from high school in Pelham.
Two things. Number one, I didn't get the chance last week to comment on how you pronounce the word Blanche. Like you're just absolutely dripping in disdain for the person who has that name. Blanche. Number two, did you get any details about the party? Were there any famous sports figures making eggs or bacon?
Did not get any details. We'll need to follow up with Paul Ferrante. But Paul, thank you for telling me about the prom party.
Joel Anderson still hard at work on Slow Burn Season 8, becoming Justice Thomas, including, the world learned last week, interviewing Clarence Thomas's mom at her house. Tune in May 31st. Get pumped. In our Slate Plus segment this week, Jody Avirgan, the host of the podcast Good Sport, will be here, and we'll talk with him about how to make a fan, looking at case studies of Formula One racing and the Savannah Bananas baseball team. To hear us discuss that, you need to be a Slate Plus member. You get bonus segments on this and other Slate shows. You get ad-free shows, and you get to support us. Slate.com/hangup+ is the link to sign up. Slate.com/hangup+. As we record this on Monday morning, all 8 NBA playoff series are underway. Giannis, Ja Morant, and Tyler Hero all got hurt. Paul George still hurt, and some teams won while other teams lost. There will be plenty of time to talk about all of that in the weeks to come, but this past weekend, there was only one game that lit up the sky. Going into the season, the Sacramento Kings had the longest active playoff drought, 17 years, in any of the 4 major North American pro sports leagues. They also had the longest streak of losing seasons, 16 in NBA history. But on Saturday night, Reggie Theus was not prowling the sidelines, and Bino Udrich was not running the point. And somehow, the Sacramento Kings took down the 4-time champion Golden State Warriors 126-123 in front of a home crowd that was something closer to deranged than rowdy. Defector's Patrick Redford was there, and after the game, he filed a dispatch from what he called the loudest place I've ever been. Patrick, if you can hear me, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. I can barely hear you. It was such a wild atmosphere, I think. Every regular season game, there's about 30% of the arena is full of Warriors fans. This time it was about 5, and maybe that's charitable. There were no yellow shirts there.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about my first question, which is you had a fact in your story for Defector that I found pretty amazing, which is that Kings-Warriors Game 1, Sacramento, the most expensive non-finals ticket in NBA playoff history. I guess we can thank inflation for some of that, but I guess when the supply of playoff games is 1 per 17 years, the demand is going to be high. So what was the anticipation like going into Saturday night, and how did it feel kind of walking up to the arena?
Waiting that long for something is kind of this hard thing to do because eventually you get it and kind of no one knows how to act. So Kings fans in my life who live in like Baltimore, Chicago, New York, had circled this date for months and months and said, I'm going to pay whatever it takes to come. And then once they saw what that actually was like, they were like, I am going to watch it on television. That is not possible. And, 17 years, there's definitely more than 18,000 Kings fans out there who wanted to come and couldn't. And those who did definitely seized their moment and turned it into as big of a party as possible. And I'm really curious to see if tonight it becomes like a normal playoff atmosphere for Game 2. I really don't think it will because those tickets are still just as expensive. And I think Warriors fans probably didn't come because they usually get to see 4 series every year. And why would you pay through the teeth to come see a game in Sacramento when you can simply pay half as much to go to San Francisco?
To be clear, Patrick, you are a fan of this team. You were not there just as a reporter. You have lived most of your life, I guess, with the futility of the Kings. I mean, the last time the Kings were really relevant in the NBA playoff conversation was in 2002 when Chris Webber and the Kings lost in 6 games to the Lakers. And
7 games, Stefan. 7 games.
7 games. I'm sorry.
Game 6 was the one that the ref stole. Game 7, the Kings lost on their own.
The 5 was the Horry shot.
6 games, 6 games, 7 games. That was the game, of course, that spawned a Warren report worth of conspiracy theory. So long time for you.
Yeah. One of my favorite things about the first game was talking to friends, fans on the concourse, and just asking them sort of what their life was like the last time the Kings made the playoffs. Like, I was in middle school. This one of my reporter friends who I was sitting in the press box with, he was, I think, 10 years old. It's really been just such an amazing long time. I really liked seeing all of the old Kings legends. Like Vlade Divac was there, Bobby Jackson was there, but the person that touched me the most was Jason Thompson, who I think is this franchise's leader in either franchise or Sacramento era leader in minutes played. And he was drafted after the streak, or once the streak began, and his career was way over before it ended. And just seeing a guy who was there throughout the worst of the lean years, sitting courtside, celebrating the team, it was oddly touching, because it's one thing to, show up, oh, I was on the Western Conference team, everyone loves me. But to have someone like that still feel like a connection towards this franchise that, gave him a career, but probably led to a lot of frustration and pain was, I was weirdly moved by that. I didn't expect that. So
let's rewind to before this season. And you had a franchise that, as we've discussed, they had another losing season in 2021, 2022. There was a sense that they were so desperate to even make the play-in, to get 10th place, to have some sort of postseason, that they had made moves, or particularly a move that was considered by knowledgeable NBA fans to be stupid. That they traded Tyrese Halliburton, this guy who this year proved it is not a future star, a current star, one of the best guards in the league, for Domantas Sabonis, a player who was an all-star, but maybe that meant he was the 12th best player in the Eastern Conference, and he's a kind of traditional big man, not somebody who, new school types would say, this is a guy who's a franchise centerpiece. And it turned out that a move that was considered like win now and mortgage the future, and maybe win now to get 8th place if all things kind of panned out, turned this team into one of the best teams in the NBA and sort of revived the fan base, revived the franchise. Do you think the criticism of the deal and of the direction that the Kings front office took was actually reasonable and it just completely defied expectations? Or do you think the Kings were actually smart and knew what they were doing and everybody else was dumb?
I think I'm very well positioned to answer this question as a national media member and as a Kings fan, because Kings fans have spent the last year just dunking on JJ Redick for calling the trade malpractice and asking for, the team to be seized by the NBA or whatever. But at the time, it was sort of hard to make any other case that didn't rely on a certain amount of faith, because, if you look at the sort of stylistic direction the NBA is going, it's spread, pick and roll, 5 out, and Tyrese Halliburton is this like genius level passer, profiles to be sort of the perfect player for that style. And then Sabonis as a big man who neither shoots threes nor blocks shots. It's sort of like, it's hard to envision a good defense being built around him. And so I think because of all the uncertainty or all the things that had to break right in order for the Sabonis fit to work, it made a certain amount of sense, I think, as national media to look at that and then look at this long history of disastrous trades and personnel moves and draft picks and say, like, the odds are this probably will not work out. And, people are wrong all the time. I don't like to rake people over their predictions. And I think one reason it did work out is because the organization kind of got out of their own way a little bit. And this is the first time I think a GM has hired the coach in Sacramento in the Vivek Ranadive era. Usually, if it works the other way around, that's usually a bad thing. The GM tends not to trust the coach they inherit. And like Luke Walton, he gets fired 12 games or whatever into last season, and it's kind of a disaster. So this year was the first time Mike Brown comes in, and there was a real sort of coherency to the franchise that you hadn't seen in a long time. And even in the summer when everyone was predicting them to finish, I think the consensus was 11th, one spot out of the play-in race. The players talked about sort of like the fit and the culture in this different way. And at all these press conferences, De'Aaron Fox and Malik Monk are constantly asked, when did you know this would be different? And I guess there's maybe some sort of post facto justification, but they basically all said immediately once Domas and Mike Brown got there in the summer.
And in terms of Sabonis, though, a lot of the credit has to go to Mike Brown. I mean, he had a vision for how to use him and how to restructure this offense to maximize efficiency. I read a piece by Zach Cram in The Ringer from a few weeks ago, in which he said that many of the Kings' offensive principles stem from what Brown taught the Nigerian national team leading up to the 2020 Olympics. And that was more movement, more cutting, more spacing the floor, and then turning Sabonis into a sort of handoff machine and an assist machine, which he really hadn't been at other stages of his career.
Yeah, it's been really, really incredible to watch. Both Domas and then guys like Kevin Huerter and Malik Monk all get more expanded roles this season. Like those latter two mostly just stood in the corner, and Domas pretty much always played with another big. And the theory is he tries hard on defense, but he's not much of a rim protector. And so the theory is you can't build a top 20 defense around him. And I think the thing everyone was excited about this year is Mike Brown has this defensive reputation. He dialed up the perfect game plan for the Warriors to take out Luka Doncic in the Western Conference Finals last year. And it's been really funny to then see the Kings have the #1 offensive rating in NBA history and just a terrible, unplayable defense with Mike Brown at the helm. And I think it's a testament to his adaptability as a coach to realize what his strengths are, and that if you have Domas running these incredible, I really love that Zach Cram piece, by the way. I thought it was great. If you have Domas running all these handoffs with movement, that's a much more stable base to build from than surrounding Fox and Domas with 3 good defenders. And in that Warriors game, these are two teams that love to run, love to shoot, both with somewhat questionable defenses, definitely more so in the Kings end. And it was really fun to see them play their regular season style and just get really silly with it and not slow the game down, not like really fight each other. It was such a thrilling game.
And De'Aaron Fox did what he has done all season in the fourth quarter. It seems like a lock to win whatever the new NBA Clutch Award is going to be called. I forget.
I think it's Jerry West Award.
Oh, Mr. Clutch, of course. He will win the Jerry West Award, it seems like. And in this game, he did what, as I said, did what he's done all season. And back to the Halliburton thing, something that was said around that trade is that the reason that they traded Halliburton is that teams actually wanted him and nobody wanted De'Aaron Fox, or he was kind of, it would have been selling low on him at that point, which seems crazy now watching him look like the best player on the floor in a game against the Golden State Warriors. But, and maybe you can validate my point here, Patrick. The thing I love just stylistically about watching De'Aaron Fox is when he does that kind of step back, jump shot, high arcing shot, I feel like he deserves extra points because I know Steph does this as well, but I feel like his swishes swish better than other players' swishes. Like, it's like the opposite of a Kawhi Leonard make, where it just like kind of, it seems like he forces it through the basket by sheer force of will. And Fox, it just like goes straight up and straight through without even like hinting that it might touch the net.
Yeah, there were definitely, I was sitting behind the basket and there were a couple of moments where I wasn't sure if the shot went in or not because like the net just doesn't move and I had to watch the crowd's reaction. There was a great story, I think it was by Brendan Nunez for the Kings Herald, about how Fox went on his honeymoon this summer and he brought Sacramento Kings assistant coach Luke Laux with him on his honeymoon. And I think he also cut it short because he was like, yes, we're getting married, this is nice, but also my jumper is kind of busted. And I mean, that's been the biggest reason for his improvement this year is he can hit a shot from 15 feet, which is theoretically the worst shot you can take, the contested long two. But if it's not contested and you can get that open shot no matter what in every possession, like it's not that it's a bad shot. I think it's that only superstars should be taking those shots. And I mean, 38 points in his playoff debut, I think that's tied for the second most in NBA history. It was just amazing to see at that stage with that team guarding him.
It was a home win. They are playing the Golden State Warriors. This could go 6 or 7 games, and let's hope it does. I want to pull back a little bit though, and talk about the sort of narrative redemption or twist here, because I mean, this is a year ago, almost to the day, the Sacramento Bee wrote a story that was headlined, "How the Kings owner made Sacramento basketball hell." And the basketball hell part referred to a former employee who said the team had toxic work environment in which people don't trust each other and a culture of chaos where change was constant, direction was lacking, and decision-making power shifted depending on who shared Ranadive's views. The turnaround in the Love Fest is more than Sabonis. I mean, this is shocking. This is like a complete organizational flip. It's not like Ranadive had any love when he bought this team a decade ago either. He's been mocked and criticized pretty consistently since.
Yeah, and I think this is definitely a case of winning fixes everything, because he also gave an interview that raised my eyebrows to Anscape's Mark Spears recently, where he said, people are giving me a lot of credit for stepping away from the decision-making this season, but I just want to go on record. I did a lot of that. I'm more involved than ever, which is like as a fan, that should set off alarm bells. I haven't been around the team in person as long, but things seem good now. But also one does wonder, if the losing starts again, what that looks like, or if they learn the right lessons. This is one of the best seasons you can have as a franchise and as a fan, because every story is positive. The other shoe's not going to drop. And something that I'm really, as a journalist, I want to see what that first loss in Sacramento feels like, because you wait 17 years for something, eventually it happens. And like becoming just another basketball franchise is kind of maybe a sad endpoint, but like that's where this is going. Like, I don't think they're going to win the championship this year. I don't want to project the future, but like at some point, the other shoe's going to drop and this magical season's going to end, and they'll start next year with actual expectations and pressure. And, the narrative trajectory will not just be ever upward. And I think that's when we'll really find out who this organization is.
This conversation about winning, curing everything for ownership, you might hear some echoes of that in the segment we're about to have about Dan Snyder. But, to generalize from my personal experience, Patrick, the expectations thing reminds me of the Pelicans, who I root for in the NBA and how this season was such a massive disappointment on so many levels. But also the game that this game one of victory for the Kings reminds me of the most is a game that I was at in person, and there will never be anything like it ever again for the rest of my life for the history of this franchise, which was the New Orleans Saints winning their first ever playoff game in 2000 after decades run of never having a winning season, after another decade plus of never winning a playoff game. It never gets better than that. I mean, winning the Super Bowl is great, but the feeling of delirium, the feeling of disbelief that this could possibly happen to a team, a franchise that you had learned to be hurt by for so long. And that is, we can talk about the future and being normal again, but I do think it's worth, and I'm sure you are, reveling in that and Saturday night, because that is going to be a thing that you and tens of thousands of other people are never going to forget. There's never going to be anything like that again.
Right, because it's also, Patrick, the fact that this was a team and a city and a franchise mired in irrelevancy for so long. This is not like the Red Sox almost winning and finally winning after however many years. This is like a team
it's
that
also
is
less annoying than that because it's not
and much less
Boston.
Annoying than that because of the irrelevancy and the lack of national media attention. I mean, so this is, in some ways, like the best kind of sports story, I think. And that's why you savor this and think about how lucky you were to just be there watching it.
Yeah, and like, you know, a joke I've always made is that there are two NBA franchises with oxymoronic names, the Utah Jazz and the Sacramento Kings. And if it doesn't get better than this, you know, I can take that, but I hope it does.
Let's end with Light the Beam. The beam was lit. De'Aaron Fox pushed the button and Vivek kind of tried to get his hand in there, sort of getting at what we were talking about before. But this is a thing that, was started at the beginning of this year, these lasers that shoot up into the sky. It seems like it would be cheesy, and maybe it is cheesy. But what do you think about the beam and kind of how the city has embraced it?
I loved the beam. Sacramentans, our expectations are so low. You know, forever it's just been give us a 500 team, we'll love them. You know, they sold out games for terrible teams for years and years. And I loved on Saturday night walking around the city and seeing from, 15, 20 blocks away, the beam still high in the sky. Light the beam.
Patrick Redford, writer for Defector, will post a link to his story about the Kings' magnificent victory on our show page. Patrick, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, Dave McKenna on Dan Snyder. At the end of your first year, Discover credit cards automatically double all the cash back you've earned. That's right. Everything you earned doubled. All the cash back from eating at your favorite soup dumpling restaurant doubled. All the cash back from that trip where you sort of learned to snowboard also doubled. And the best part, you don't have to do anything ridiculous to get it. Nope, Discover does it automatically. Seriously though, see terms and check out for yourself at discover.com/match.
A group led by two dudes with a combined net worth of almost $12 billion has reached, according to reports, a preliminary deal to buy the Washington Commanders from Dan Snyder. Since acquiring the team in 1999, Snyder, who was once described with a straight face as a business wunderkind, turned an iconic franchise with a bizarrely hypnotic hold over a city into a petty, abusive, toxic, unstable, unlikable, grossly mismanaged, and repeatedly investigated loser. For his skill in wrecking the unwreckable, Snyder will walk away with $6 billion. Joining us now is a man who once said,
I owe pretty much everything I have professionally to Dan Snyder.
That's our friend Dave McKenna of Defector, and he is referring to being sued by Snyder in 2010 over a piece he wrote for DC's City paper that chronicled from A to Z Snyder's greatest hits up to that time, including selling expired airline peanuts to fans and suing septuagenarian season ticket holders. Snyder hired a bunch of white shoe law firms to go after Dave, and then dropped his lawsuit because, well, it was a nuisance lawsuit filed by a guy who has been nothing but a nuisance in D.C. for the past 24 years. So, Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for letting me relive that quote.
All right, if you owe pretty much everything professionally to Dan Snyder, and Snyder once said of you, I think he has an obsession, some sort of issue, and needs to get over it and grow up. What does Dan Snyder's potential departure mean for you, Dave McKenna?
Well, I mean, as I've said, whatever relevance I have is all tied to this one man. So the day Snyder's gone, I'm Von Meter on November 23rd. I not only like anyone who knows about me, if they know anything about me, it's because I'm a victim of Dan Snyder's bullying, but also like pretty much every story I wrote for 10 years or 11 years was a Dan Snyder story. I mean, when he sued me, I had to, the lawyer said, go back and pull up every story involving Dan Snyder. We got to go over it. And I looked, and then so I sent it to the archive people, and they sent back, I had written 488 stories involving Dan Snyder at City Paper. I had no idea I had written 488 stories in my life. So I guess, the only true thing Snyder said, the whole thing, I guess, is that I was obsessed with him.
So in our conversations about this over the last few days, Dave, you don't seem to have reached the acceptance phase. I want you to make the case to our audience that Dan Snyder is not actually going to sell the team, that this isn't real, that the reporting is kind of sketchy, that we shouldn't believe it yet.
A lot of caveats here.
As back to me, my relevance is tied to whatever relevance I have is tied to Dan Snyder. All of Dan Snyder's relevance is tied to his ownership of an NFL franchise. I mean, he has owned and fucked up several other businesses in his career, but he's gotten rid of all those. Now it's down to the Washington football team, and it's all he's got. Like, what is Dan Snyder without the team? He's Mr. Potter without the bank. He's got nothing. No one's coming to Dan Snyder again for anything except ridicule once he leaves the team.
He can sue you so many times with that $6 billion. Just think of how many lawsuits that's going to pay for.
I mean, as much as he spent, I think he could go through $6 billion pretty quick if that would have lasted much longer. There were at one point, and he had 5 law firms out to get me fired. Like he really should have. He could have just bought the City Paper for what he was paying any one of those. For what he paid Lanny Davis, he could have owned the City Paper.
He also hired a lawyer that represented Harvey Weinstein. He had a real dream team going there.
It was bizarre at the time, and it's just funny now. It was quite a chapter.
And one of the things, one of the nice little details in a long Washington Post takeout on Snyder's tenure over the weekend by Mark Fisher and Liz Clark was that he is selling his mansions, some of them in the greater Washington area. And, quote, in a filing to the British government last fall, Snyder said his primary residence was in England. So maybe this will actually happen. I mean, it's not as if the NFL doesn't want to get rid of Dan Snyder. The pressure on him at this point to sell has to be coming from Park Avenue in New York and everywhere else in the league. I mean, the one thing he doesn't want to do, I mean, not that he doesn't have a high bar for humiliation, is to be completely drummed out of the league. He wants to go out on his terms, I would think.
Well, him moving to England is great because I am the grandson of 4 Irish immigrants, and I have despised England my whole life. So he's just one more reason to despise England. Him moving there is perfect for me. But yeah, I mean, he's holding on, like I'm going to hold on to this, like what can he do next? What is the next phase of Dan Snyder? I mean, money, I think money is important to him, but power was always much more important. Using that money was power to him, and using it without power. I mean, what's he going to do? Because no one's going to want to do business with him again. This is his last stand. I mean, it's hard. I'm not that I'm pitying him. What is a guy just going to sit around and count whatever billions he comes out of this with? That's all he's going to have to do.
Conventional wisdom for a long time was that Snyder was never going to sell the team for the reasons that you've cited. Conventional wisdom was also that he was never going to change the name. He said it very starkly that he would never change the name. And then he did. Was that a fundamental kind of misunderstanding of this guy? The idea that out of spite, out of pettiness, he dropped a lawsuit against you too, by the way, which he said he wasn't going to do. Like, what is the reason why all of these things that seemed like, red lines for him, that he was never going to do that, never going to do this, never going to sell the team, that all of those turned out not to be red lines at all?
I think in those cases you mentioned, I think he was finally, the yes people around him finally had convinced him, like with the naming of the team, like you've lost this war, you're done. You have to do it. And I think in dropping the suit, it was the exact same thing. His 5 law firms had run out. They were about to come out with a ruling on a federal court ruling on slap suits, specifically related to his case. They were about to. DC Council had proposed passed an anti-slap suit, measure that he was going to become the face of. He says he's not going to do anything, but when he has no other options, he does what he's never going to do.
Well, he also tries to spin it into victory. Like, this is what I wanted to do all the time. And you're certainly right that he likes power. He likes attention. He wants to be on this club. I mean, $6 billion is going to be a nice consolation prize. But he does, whether he's trying to delude the public unsuccessfully or whether he's deluding himself, he does always at least try to say, oh, actually, this thing I didn't want to do is what I wanted to do all along.
He did it. And when he did drop the lawsuit, his statement was that he had gotten everything out of it that he wanted. And all he got was a beating out of it. So unless he wanted a beating, you're absolutely right. He made that up. I'm also kind of, melancholy about his departure, if indeed it is a departure, because my theory was that as bad a guy as he's proven himself to be, as big a dumbass as he's proven himself to be, the only unpardonable sin Dan Snyder had with the fans of the Washington football team was that he didn't win. Losing is the biggest Band-Aid. And so I wanted to see that day when the Lombardi trophy was handed down to little Dan Snyder, what the reaction would have been. I wanted to see, to test my theory. Would he been the first guy booed while holding up the trophy? I don't think he would have been. I think but I'll never know. I guess we'll never know now.
Well, that's what he was banking on all along, wasn't it? That winning would make people love him. I mean, people like Dan Snyder crave adoration. I mean, that's why he hired fleets of yes people. He could afford to do it.
I don't believe that he craves adoration at all.
Really?
I think maybe when he came in, I back to the Mr. Potter comparison. I really think at some point he embraced the heel role. He is a dumbass, but he has made no move to curry favor with anybody. Everything he does is anti-fan, makes him more hateable. What has he done that what action of his would lead you to believe that he craves adoration?
Nothing other than that winning would provide it. And the ends would justify the means. He could justify having run a toxic workplace and abusing women and alienating fans and overcharging for everything and stiffing vendors, because winning, I'm sure he believed, would be the cure-all. I am friends with...
I think he believes stiffing vendors is winning. I believe he thinks that mistreating women is winning. I believe he believes that him being in control is winning. I think the adoration he is looking for is not from fans. It's from Jerry Jones. It's from members of the NFL club. It's from the kind of people who would consider him a business wunderkind. The people whose opinions he cares about are the people who are actually that, rather than he who pretends to be that. I mean, do you think that that's right, Dave? Well, his acquisition of things, of big status symbol things, like he bought the most expensive mansion in Virginia history recently, and he still held the most expensive mansion in Maryland history, and which he still owns now. And when he bought his $160 million yacht or whatever with the IMAX, theater, the floating IMAX theater, he held on to his $100 million yacht. Things are big things, big rich things are wins to him.
What do you think of Sally Jenkins's argument made in the Washington Post that it was women who took down Dan Snyder? She writes, from former cheerleader Tiffany Bacon-Scorby to marketing executive Tiffany Johnston to investigators Beth Wilkinson and Mary Jo White, they're the ones who really forced Daniel Snyder to sell the team.
It isn't as if those accusations, popped up 3 weeks ago when he's selling the team now. No, this stuff has been around forever. He was mistreating cheerleaders a long, long time ago. He was doing all the stuff that came out in the congressional hearings a long, long time ago. The times, the culture around him changed, where women have a voice now, that and a powerful guy can't just get away with anything.
Well, I think that's part of the argument, is that these women came forward or were put in positions to investigate him and lob accusations against him at a time, in a moment in our nation's history when people actually care, at least somewhat, about that stuff.
Well, I love Sally Jenkins, and she's smarter than me. So if she feels that way, it's probably right. I feel it's a career achievement award that he's getting his ass kicked out of the league.
In the history of professional sports, there have been plenty of asshole owners who have overcome their assholeness and were able to put together, or have people put together, teams that have succeeded. Dan Snyder's achievement of futility for 2+ decades is really kind of remarkable when you think about the amount of money he had, the amount of the willingness he had to spend it on players and coaches and management. You would have thought that over all of these years, the Wheel of Fortune wheel would have landed on make it to a NFC championship game at the very least, or make it to a Super Bowl just from pure random luck. Why do you think it failed so spectacularly, and how much of the blame does he deserve for that?
He is the same guy now that he was. I used to, around the time he sued me, I started calling him the most consistent man on the planet. And I believed it then, and I believed it now. There are not two sides to Dan Snyder. If you deal with him now, you know what you're getting into. And it's almost admirable, or what more can you ask of an adult than consistency, It's a dark consistency, but it really is. He doesn't do anything surprising. Like, what has he done that isn't what has Dan Snyder done that isn't a Dan Snyder move? Everything he does fails. And also with the consistency part that has made me think, like, what has saved him is his lack of email, of the lack of digital evidence against him, because in 2023, and for several years now, the only investigations done against a person, it's the digital footprint that does them in. And he, to his credit, he never took up email. I believe that he never didn't use it at the beginning because he wanted his minions to come read him, his servants to come read him what was going on in the news. But at some point, he had to realize that, hey, this could be, it's better for me. There's always a degree of separation if I don't, send out anything myself. And the congressional hearings, it was amazing how there was a degree of separation between him and every single accusation, except the one on the plane, where whatever happened, where there was allegedly a very direct sexual assault committed by him. That's the accusation. But everything else was, there were his underlings were actually the ones who carried out the deeds. And there was never an email or a text from Snyder to link him to any of these. So, it's Trumpian in his lack of the digital evidence against him.
Maybe we can end with this. I moved to D.C. in 2002. I've never known this town to be without Dan Snyder. You've told me tales, Dave, of what it was like growing up around here when the team ruled not only the city, but the region. The city that Snyder is leaving behind is one where I would argue this team, compared to in other major cities, is like the least relevant, the least rooted for, the least followed, that a generation of fans was lost, maybe not because he's a terrible guy, but just because he presided over this losing. Do you think that it's possible that a new owner or just a string of winning seasons could bring it back to what it was before? Or did Snyder kill something forever that can never be brought back?
It is basically, with him, it's an expansion franchise. It's because of the history, the names are different. It's going to be, the history is almost irrelevant. But, the NFL has such a grip on everything that I think it's got a great chance of coming back. Back to me one more time. I am a fan of the team again. I stopped writing about, I write about Dan Snyder very rarely. And during the pandemic, a friend of mine and his kid and me and my kids, our only break from each other, of getting out of the house was to go watch the games on Sunday. And absent the reporting, because it is impossible to root for a team you report for, not for ethical reasons. It's just become you have to face what a shitty business professional sports is. But in front of the TVs on Sundays, you don't have to deal with that. And I found myself like unconsciously, cheering on Taylor Heineke. Like just rooting, yelling at the TV when he did something great, and it was it was a great thing. And can the next owner have all the DC glitterati and politicians in the owner's box? Probably so. I mean, the NFL is a monster, and will they link it to the glories of John Riggins? Sonny Jurgensen, I don't think so. I think that Snyder has tainted whatever the franchise to this point, where it's just we got to just move forward.
Yeah, it's a reclamation project. And one thing that Snyder's exit certainly will do is allow whatever new owners come in to negotiate a new stadium deal in DC or somewhere in the close-in suburbs. I want to end, though, Dave, with a little more about you. You mentioned how you are Vaughn Meter to John F. Kennedy. And most people probably won't get that and will have to look it up. But did you know that Dan Snyder was born on November 23rd, 1964, 1 year after the Kennedy assassination?
I did not know that. But you're saying this is all preordained.
Clearly.
Is that going to be story number 491?
Dan Snyder's his life's mission was to leave me as Vaughn Meter. And he's done it.
Dave McKenna writes about everything for Defector. He is Dan Snyder's worst nightmare. Dave, thank you for coming on this show.
Well, thank you, because as you will not, this is my last hurrah with you guys, and throughout, my relevant period, which coincided with Dan Snyder's ownership, you have been very kind to me. So thank you for all the kindnesses through the years. Keep up the good work.
Well, it was nice knowing you. Enjoy the rest of your life.
I'm going to go write some Kennedy jokes.
In our next segment, we'll talk to John Wertheim of Sports Illustrated about the women's tennis tour returning to China.
When you're drafting your fantasy team, do you ever wish you could handpick the best stars for your business team? If you're building your talent roster, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills, when you can do it all with Indeed. Find top talent fast with Indeed's suite of powerful hiring tools like matching assessments and virtual interviews. Hate waiting? Indeed's U.S. data shows more than 80% of Indeed employers find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job. Indeed knows when you're growing your own business, you have to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for quality applications that match your must-have job requirements. Visit Indeed.com/hangup to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/hangup, Indeed.com/hangup. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed. It's time to reboot your credit card with Apple Card. You work hard for your money, so you should be able to spend it on the things you actually want. With Apple Card, you can kiss fees goodbye. There aren't and never will be any annual, foreign transaction, late, or over-the-limit fees, not even hidden ones. Apply now in the Wallet app on iPhone and start using it right away. Subject to credit approval, late or missed payments will result in additional interest accumulating toward your balance. Variable APRs for Apple Card range from 15.49% to 26.49% based on credit worthiness. Rates as of March 1st, 2023. In November 2021, we ran a piece at Slate headlined, "Women's Tennis is Risking Millions to Take on China." That story by Ben Rothenberg was about the women's tour's response to the disappearance of Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai after she publicly accused a retired Chinese vice premier of sexual assault. After Peng disappeared from public view, the Women's Tennis Association's chief executive, Steve Simon, publicly called out the Chinese authorities and eventually suspended the tour's operations in China. A huge deal, given that women's tennis had staked a huge part of its economic future on playing events in China. Back then, the WTA's action stood in very stark contrast to other corporate entities, both in and out of sports, which had said little to nothing about Chinese human rights violations, lest they risk losing the Chinese market. But now, about a year and a half later, as John Wertheim reported in Sports Illustrated last week, the WTA is set to return to China, despite Peng's freedom and safety remaining in doubt. Joining us now is John Wertheim. He was last on the show to help us remember our friend Grant Wahl. Welcome back, John.
Thanks. You get me for all the happy topics. Good to be here. How are you guys?
Great to talk to you. You reported in Sports Illustrated that a full slate of WTA tournaments will resume in China this fall, including the tour's crown jewel, the WTA finals held in Shenzhen. From the outside, based on just reading your stories, this looks like a total capitulation and that it's entirely financially motivated. Is that how it looks to you?
This is a total capitulation, and it is entirely financially motivated. There's actually a lot of, I think, really interesting complexity and backstory and context here. But yeah, the bottom line is the WTA made this demand. They took a very principled stand, and about 16 months ago, they made this demand. You know, it's unacceptable for allegations of sexual assault to be, this is my paraphrase, but not by too much. You know, that these allegations can't be swept under the rug, and we will not return unless we have this full and transparent investigation. Full and transparent investigation is exactly what the tour asked for. They didn't get it. They didn't even get a response. And here they are 16 months later, sort of hand in hat going back. And I think I think some of this is, it's a capitulation. There's no other way to spin it. But I think it's also, they didn't get any help. I mean, the men's tour, could have chosen to stand with them. The men's tour did not. No other sport did either. There was a fairly successful Olympics in the interim. And basically 16 months later, this was sort of a thought exercise for what happens when you try to stare down China, and the WTA tour blinked.
Yeah, you wind up losing tens of millions of dollars for your business. And this seems to be a pattern. You know, this is what happens when sports do business and feel the need to do business in authoritarian countries, whether it's the IOC or FIFA or the Premier League, or even athletes who need and want to work. Look at the Brittany Griner story. You know, China's hosted 2 of the last 7 Olympics. The IOC actually abetted the Chinese propaganda after Peng disappeared when Thomas Bach at the 2022 Winter Games posed for a photo op with her. Is this an intractable problem? I mean, it seems to be that the WTA is saying we may have more success working from within. Is that the message they're trying to convey? And is that a realistic one? Because it's the one that pretty much every sports organization that does business in countries like China seems to articulate.
Yeah, it's a great point. And there are, for the record, I think there are four Chinese women in the top 50. So that is, you could certainly point to that. Look, we need to go there. We need to give these emerging players a chance to play in front of their own fans. But I mean, the one thing that strikes me that's different than our usual sort of sports washing discussion is that here is a specific case of the WTA having an athlete. I mean, Peng Shuai was an active player. She was not yet retired at the time of her allegation. And so you have the specific example. We really got a glimpse into what an authoritarian state looks like. I mean, there's this, it's called a social media post, but it really was something much more than that. I mean, this was really a personal essay. This was almost 2,000 words with specificity and details and names, receipts, as we would say. Within half an hour, that post was scrubbed. You can no longer search. I mean, you can search tennis on Weibo. You can't find Peng Shuai on Weibo anymore. I mean, it's just, we really got this glimpse of how sort of a censorship machine works. And yeah, I mean, I think it's the IOC is really an interesting part of this, because I think the WTA, there were a lot of sort of miscalculations and misassessments. And I think one of them was, with these Winter Olympics coming up, China was vulnerable. And what did you have? The IOC not only didn't back the WTA and showed no sort of empathy for Peng Shuai, who, apart from everything else, apart from being a 20-year tennis player, was a former Olympian. And then you have Thomas Bach, as you say, Stefan. I think that's a really important point. It wasn't just that the IOC, you sort of expected them to take an the sort of invertebrate thanks but no thanks, we'll sit this one out. But the fact that the IOC was actually complicit in this campaign, this show that, hey, Peng Shuai's fine and she misspoke and there's nothing to see here, folks. The fact that Thomas Bach would actually sit in a venue alongside Peng Shuai to pass on this message of, nothing to see here, everything's just fine, was really startling to me.
The WTA statement that you obtained, John, I thought was actually surprisingly candid. Here's an excerpt from it. After 16 months of suspended tennis competition in China and sustained efforts at achieving our original requests, the situation has shown no sign of changing. We have concluded we will never fully secure those goals, and it will be our players and tournaments who ultimately will be paying an extraordinary price for their sacrifices. It's an admission of defeat. It's not just saying, it's not really particularly mealy-mouthed. It's saying we tried, we failed, we give up, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to read between the lines, there are a couple of things. One of them is there was a real division within the WTA board and within these various factions. And you had, including Steve Simon, the CEO and chairman, who was very outspoken to begin with. He was sort of saying, listen, we got to hold the line here. This is going to look bad. And then you had this other faction essentially say, enough grandstanding, COVID's passed, and there are tens of millions of dollars that were, that are imperiling this organization. It is interesting to me that
you did a feature, John, a couple of weeks ago, and your reporting at that point was that Steve Simon did still want to hold the line as of 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, this went before a board vote, and some of the board is tournaments, some of the board is players, and he was defeated. I mean, he was, this went to a board vote, and Steve Simon's position was not the one that was voted on. I mean, I do think it's interesting that just because they're holding tournaments doesn't necessarily mean the players are going. And what you did not hear in that statement, but also what you didn't hear subsequent, was players saying, oh, thank heavens, I can't wait to return to China. And I think some of these fields are going to be very interesting. There's a lot of money at play, but the players never particularly like going there. It's at the end of the season when they're tired. Some of them have commercial responsibilities. One of them is Naomi Osaka, but she won't be playing this year. I think it's going to be really interesting to see which players actually. It's one thing to hold the tournament. It's another thing to actually get the stars to commit. And I did not get a sense there was a lot of enthusiasm from the players to return here. I think these are, these were a lot of suits that saw their balance sheets. But this was not, Coco Gauff and Iga Swiatek and company saying, boy, I really miss playing in Shenzhen.
And there are also still COVID concerns for players. About getting stuck there. Who knows what will happen with the kinds of lockdowns that China has imposed. The other piece here, John, is that I feel hasn't been reported out yet is how China will respond to the WTA saying it wants to come back. Just because the WTA says we want to come back, does that necessarily mean that the Chinese government and sports authorities, which are one and the same, are going to be supportive of the WTA's return, or will there be some retribution for the women's tennis tour, basically humiliating China on a world stage.
I asked Steve Simon that very question last week, and he sort of said, well, we've gotten assurances that, they understood the position. Basically no hard feelings. I don't know how that plays out. It's not a perfect analogy, but I liken this to someone as, hey, kids, we're not going on vacation unless you do your homework. And the kids say, screw you, Dad, we don't like our homework. And 16 months later, you say, okay, so do you want to go to Cancun or to Disney? I mean, this was a complete capitulation, so I'm not sure what the repercussions will be. I mean, these events will be held. They're corporate sponsors. Gemdale, that's underwriting this, has clearly given assurances that, we're all good here. I don't know what happens, though, when there is controversy on the ground. I don't know. I mean, again, the WTA had asked to speak directly with Peng Shuai. In 16 months, that has not happened. And they've said, well, we've gotten these secondhand accounts that her safety is no longer a concern. And you sort of say, wait a second. I mean, analogize this to any other sports league. The WNBA hasn't been able to get firsthand contact with Brittany Griner, but they're returning to Russia. I mean, it's really a strange fact pattern. And I guess if you're taking your intermediary at your word, hey, you can come back here for a full slate of events and, no harm, no foul. It's all good. I guess you plant your events there again, but I'm not sure materially how this plays out, especially if there is some other controversy, and there's no guarantee there won't be.
Two little tidbits from your reporting, John, that I thought were super interesting that I wanted to call out. Number one, there's obvious reasons that I think we all understand about why the tour has faced revenue shortfalls. They were holding these tournaments in China, and they were going to get money to hold the tournaments in China, and that money went away. But a reason for the financial shortfall that I didn't understand until reading your story is that, and I'm just going to quote from it now, tour sponsors such as Porsche did not pay full boat once it became clear that their signage and activations wouldn't be displayed in China, the great emerging market of 1.6 billion potential customers. So it's not just that the men's tour, Thomas Bach, who, all the people that we've talked about didn't support what the WTA did. The sponsors were like, all right, you're taking this moral stand. We're going to pull our money away because we, want those Chinese customers. Then the second thing, John, was that I didn't realize is that Ari Fleischer was apparently behind the WTA's kind of strong, forceful response to China here. Ari Fleischer, who also was recently seen doing PR work for the Saudi Arabia golf tour, the Live Tour. So funny seeing you here, Mr. Fleischer.
Yeah, we could do that in reverse order. Yes, Ari Fleischer, former mouthpiece of the Bush administration, now a sports consultant, was doing significant work for the WTA. A quick Google search would reveal he is no fan of China, and you connected the dots very quickly, and you realized some of the same language that the WTA and Steve Simon, that they were using in November of 2021 when this first broke. The word cloud matched surprisingly with Ari Fleischer op-eds from several years ago. Ari Fleischer apparently no longer does work for the WTA, I've been told, but
too busy working for the Saudis.
Well, exactly. I mean, he's still he's working for the Saudis. There was a New York Times piece last week about the various connections with Live Golf and how they've propped this up using non-Saudis, and he figured prominently. And my suspicion was that the WTA would figure out a way to end up, instead of in China, in Saudi Arabia, which would have created its own sort of set of ethical issues. But no, Ari Fleischer, at least in November 2021, played a very active role in this. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, this is sort of a bottom line, as you say. This was about balance sheets, and this was about we can't continue hemorrhaging money and ignoring this market that is responsible for a third of our revenues. But it's really quite granular. And yeah, the companies that pay for signage and like to have their car logo on the net post, they like that they're going to a country of 1.6 billion potential consumers. So there are a lot of sort of constituents here. And clearly, I think at the time, again, this was before the Olympics played out, and you had real concerns about Peng Shuai's whereabouts. And you had this very strange active WTA player makes this allegation. It's scrubbed from the internet, and nobody knows where she is. As that sort of diminished a little bit, you did get the sense that sort of the risk threshold changed, and a number of factions from other tournaments to these sponsors, to maybe even to Ari Fleischer himself, you did have a feeling that people got restless. And 16 months later, and the other thing too, if you really want to get in the weeds, in the interim, the WTA essentially sold off 20% of its business to a private equity firm. This was celebrated as a great partnership, and this shows a real investment in women's tennis. But a private equity firm doesn't take a 20% stake in an industry because they're doing this as philanthropy. So the big question is whether this private equity firm, CVC, whether they also added to this pressure of hey, listen, we've got to we've got to take the L here and get back to China because we need the money. So it's sort of tennis laid bare. I mean, it's really sort of interesting of tennis's various factions and tennis's dysfunction laid bare, but also I think there's sort of I think a lot of other industries, even outside sports, have paid pretty close attention to this, and it does not paint a great picture of what happens when you try to engage in an economic stare down with China.
Oh, you can't have it both ways. And, private equity firms also don't typically take stakes in thriving businesses very often. Mm-hmm. These are distressed assets that they go after with an attempt to prop them up and improve them. Is it fair to say that the WTA without China was a distressed asset? I mean, was there real peril here for the tour?
In the short term, yeah. I mean, China was responsible for the WTA's gross revenues are, a little more than $100 million. China, I've been told, was responsible for somewhere from 30 to 35 million. So, yeah, I mean, this is a third of the market dropping out. I mean, I think a more creative approach would be, hey, listen, we're going to miss this money, but there are other ways to recoup it. There are ways of filling and maybe even exceeding this shortfall. This frees us up to do X, Y, and Z for 3 months. They had tried at one point to sort of lean into this principled stand when they went out looking for sponsors of, hey, look, we're not just another run-of-the-mill sports league. We're the league that took on China. In the short term, clearly there was some real financial pain. And I heard that again and again, and that was reflected in the tour's finances. That was reflected in player prize money. When this year-end event was held in Shenzhen in 2019 before COVID, Ash Barty, then an active, excellent, versatile player, won, and she won $4.4 million, the biggest prize at the time for a tennis tournament, male or female, major or non-major. I mean, this was a huge bit of prize money. When Caroline Garcia of France won the event at the last WTA finals, she made about 30% of that. So everyone felt this pinch. I do think one way to have spun this was, hey, listen, this frees us up to do a lot more here, and we can take this ethical stance on China. We don't have to worry about our players making, allegations of sexual assault and then seemingly disappearing, and we can spin this into a gain. But I think, patience for that wore awfully thin.
A final thought, in sports and everywhere else, moral stands have an expiration date. Wimbledon is dropping its ban on Russian and Belarusian players, which was in place last year and will not be in place this year. To be clear, that was a moral stand that I did not agree with. But it seems like Russian and Belarusian athletes will be competing in the 2024 Olympics. Again, Thomas Bach, the head of the IOC, has been laying the groundwork, not very subtly, for that to happen, despite opposition from the US, the UK, France, and other nations. I was Googling NBA China. NBA, Ant Group launched strategic partnership in China. So, I think China in this case, and you alluded to it before, John, is, you could argue there's a fiduciary responsibility to the players that the WTA has if they couldn't figure out a way to make up that financial shortfall. Then, what can they do at this point? You can make that argument. But I also think that China is being rewarded for the fact that they paraded Peng out in public, as they've done with, people like Jack Ma. They disappear and they come back and they've been re-educated. I mean, this is a pattern that human rights observers are very familiar with. And so to say that the immediate peril and danger is over is in some sense buying into the Chinese storyline. But, what choice did the WTA have is, I think, the argument that the WTA is making. And, that's kind of where we are.
I was recently in Saudi Arabia for a piece on sports washing, and what was never said explicitly but was clear was essentially money talks, these ethical concerns will blow over. Yeah, they'll make for some uncomfortable moments, and Twitter will get a hold of them. But at the end of the day, Cristiano Ronaldo is going to come here because we're paying him $200 million, and the WWE is going to come here and live golf. Golfers will hold their nose for a bit, and then they'll play our events, and we'll all be outraged about Qatar holding the World Cup, and we'll then remember it for Messi and Mbappe. I do think what's a little different with the WTA is, first of all, the players own half this tour, so they have a voice in here. It's not just sort of a random, an agent asking as a fiduciary duty. I mean, the players are basically 50% owners of this tour. The other thing, though, is the fact that you had the specific allegation to a colleague. Peng Shuai played 18 years. She won majors in doubles. She got to the semifinals of the U.S. Open. This was someone that the players saw in the locker room, and they saw on the other side of the net. It must have been really unnerving that she makes this very detailed allegation. 30 minutes later, you can't find it anywhere on the internet. And the WTA, the tour, her own employer for 18 years, can't establish any direct contact with her. That must be chilling. And yet, if the WTA is going back after that, I wonder what the future of sports washing and authoritarian countries holding events is. Because if you can only last 16 months with that set of facts, sort of a garden variety, hey, Saudi Arabia doesn't have a great human rights record, that stands no chance.
John Wertheim is executive editor of Sports Illustrated, where his reporting on the WTA's return to China appeared. He's also an analyst for Tennis Channel and a contributing correspondent for 60 Minutes. John, thanks so much. We're going to ask you to stick around for Afterballs for reasons that will become clear to you and everyone else very shortly. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Have you ever thought, this water is too wet?
Or this beach is too sandy? My name's Christine.
And my name is Zandy.
And we're the hosts of Beach Too Sandy, Water Too Wet, a podcast where we do dramatic readings of the most wild and off-the-wall reviews on the internet.
We find the funniest real reviews about everything from Vegas weddings, matchmaking services and Trader Joe's, to caves, toddler beds, and Spirit Halloween.
You won't believe the things that people think absolutely must be said on the internet. How else would everyone know that some caves don't have Wi-Fi?
We hear about the good, the bad, and that one time Spirit Halloween sent someone a dildo instead of a Halloween costume. And believe it or not, we got to the bottom of it.
Join us every Wednesday wherever you listen to your podcasts. Beach Too Sandy, Water Too Wet is brought to you by the Forever Dog Podcast Network.
And now it is time for Afterballs, sponsored by Bennett's Prune Juice, nature's great energy builder, endorsed by Kenny Sailors, who says it was okay. I watched the third period of the Women's Ice Hockey World Championship final on Sunday night. USA-Canada, of course, for the 26th time in 28 World or Olympic Championships, the only exceptions being the 2006 Olympics when Sweden beat the U.S. in the semis, and the 2019 Worlds when Finland upset Canada in the semis also. Anyway, Canada led 3-2 going into the third period in Brampton, Ontario. Big pro-Canadian crowd, as you can imagine. The U.S. tied it on a sneaky wrister from just beyond the left circle by Caroline Harvey. Then, dramatic turn, back-to-back Canada penalties gave the USA a two-skater advantage for 49 seconds with about 4 minutes to go. The Americans capitalized fully. Hillary Knight slapped one past the Canadian goalie from close range for her second goal and the first USA lead of the game. It was Knight's record 100th point in the World Championships. 27 seconds later, still up a skater, Knight deflected in a shot to complete her hat trick for her 101st point, if you lost count. An empty netter made the final 6-3. After the handshake line, Knight and someone on Canada were named their team's players of the game and received what looked like really cool-looking custom hockey sticks. It turns out the tournament commissioned 4 Indigenous women artists to design player of the game sticks for all 31 games in the tournament. Their designs included turtles, eagles, women with flowing hair, and other native and Canadian symbols. So shout out to the artists Kathy Jameson and Anishinaabe, originally from Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Cree Ojibwa Shauna Grapentine from Rainy River, Ontario, Shanoa Simon of Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, and Angela Jason and Ojibwe from Shishegwaning First Nation. And congrats to Hillary Knight for winning a Player of the Game stick, and to the USA team for winning gold, too. Josh, what's your Player of the Game stick?
The futility of American men's tennis has been painfully obvious to anyone who's been even kind of paying attention for the last couple decades. We're about to hit the 20th anniversary of the last American man to win a Grand Slam singles title, Andy Roddick, at the 2003 U.S. Open. Happy anniversary. This after U.S. men, namely Pete Sampras, Andre Agassi, and Jim Courier, had won about 2 Grand Slams a season between 1990 and 2003. It's actually even worse than that. No man other than Roddick has even made a Grand Slam singles final in these last 20 years. But over the last year or so, there are signs that those streaks could end. If not, at the French Open coming up, if not at Wimbledon, then at some point in the not too distant future. Taylor Fritz won Indian Wells last year, maybe the biggest event outside the Grand Slams and the Tour Finals. He did make the Tour Finals too. Frances Tiafoe made the semis at the U.S. Open, taking eventual champion Carlos Alcaraz to 5 sets. And 3 other Americans, Sebastian Korda, Ben Shelton, and Tommy Paul, all made the quarters at this year's first major, the Australian Open, with Paul losing to the eventual champ Novak Djokovic in the semis. That's progress, losing to the champion in the semifinals. All that leads me to make a claim that would have been shocking at any point since Agassi and Sampras left the court and since the Williams sisters stormed onto it. Get ready to be shocked. At this moment, at this hour, as we record, American men's tennis is in a better place than American women's tennis. So let me actually start with the counter argument. I always, you got to give voice to the wrong people on the other side. The top 2 American women on that tour, Jessica Pegula and Coco Gauff, are currently ranked number 3 and number 6, both higher than the top 2 men, Fritz and Tiafoe. And both are probably better bets to win a Grand Slam title this year than any American man. And if you had to pick one American player right now who has the chance to be a transcendent star and the best player in the entire world, it would be Coco, who amazingly is still just 19 and has already made a Grand Slam singles final. There are also 15 American women in the top 100 of the live rankings at this moment, and 15 American men in the top 104. So not much daylight there. But in terms of depth and breadth of real contenders, the American men are stronger. I've already mentioned Fritz, Tiafoe, Paul. They're in the top 12 in the world in results so far this year. And I'd argue that Shelton and Korda's been out with a wrist injury since Australia, that those 2 are both more likely than any of the top 3 American men currently to win multiple Grand Slams in their careers. There's also Jensen Brooksby, Riley Opelka, Brandon Nakashima, all of whom are currently dealing with injuries, but all of whom I think could make very deep Grand Slam runs and maybe win one someday if everything were to break right. On the women's side, the top quality depth just is not there at the moment. Players like Sophia Cannon and Sloane Stephens, who have won a slam in the not too distant past, are totally off the map right now as contenders. Madison Keys and Danielle Collins, not at their peaks. They're getting older. Amanda Anisimova, who is touted as the next big thing, has not put it all together. And the next generation, players like Alicia Parks, Claire Liu, the immortal Katie Volley-Nets, Stefan, they still look a good ways away from contention if they ever do contend. Obviously, this is not a competition, even if I'm making it sound like one. The United Cup, which the U.S. won, co-ed event in Australia, there was a lot of camaraderie between the men and women, which I think is great for the sport. Injuries, as alluded to above, will also be a huge factor. But John, now it's time for you to pipe up. As a longtime observer of American tennis on both sides and a longtime sufferer of the futility on the men's side, I'm curious what you think of this analysis.
I'm completely dispassionate, so there is no suffering. That's a very compelling case you make, and bonus points for the Katie Volley-Nets name check. I think you make a lot of good points. I think some of this is sort of errors of omission. Some of this is, Sonia Kennan and Sloane Stephens, as you mentioned, are both Grand Slam champions. They are also, unlikely to win a second major. I think the big X factor, two things. One of them is Coco Gauff, as you allude to. I mean, she could put it all together at the French Open. She made the finals last year. She's a terrific doubles player. She's a transcendent star. It was not inconceivable she could win 7 straight matches. I mean, to me, the big factor here is best of 5 versus best of 3. And as long as Novak Djokovic is playing, Nadal may or may not play again, Carlos Alcaraz, just go down the line, Medvedev, can you beat those guys in a best of 5 match? That is so much harder to do than the best of 3 that the women play. Americans men's tennis has come a long way. Andy Roddick, he makes a joke that for a while there, he loved that he was the last male to win a major because it kept him relevant and it kept him, he could show up in some of the sponsor suites and he still could use that. Now he wants nothing more than for someone to snap his streak. But I just think it is so much easier to win 14 sets of tennis versus 21, to win a best of 3 match versus a best of 5. To me, that is sort of the one factor that would, I think, militate keeping my bets on the women's side. But you raise a good point. I mean, Taylor Fritz and Frances Tiafoe, those, for all intents, those are 2 top 10 players. A lot of people say Sebastian Korda is the best of the lot. Tommy Paul, as you mentioned, coming off a semifinal at the Australian Open, a former French Open junior champion, so a real chance at Roland Garros. American men's tennis has come a long way. I just am still not convinced that any of the American guys can win 21 sets in 2 weeks. 14, yes. If all men's majors were best of 3, I would be squarely in your corner. That is my one sort of factor that gives me pause.
All right, counter-argument to your counter-argument, and then Stefan can decide who the winner is. I think that makes total sense. But the other thing that comes into best of 5 is it's more likely, and it has been, and we've seen this in the last couple of years, that the top male players sometimes don't make it through the tournament or don't compete in the tournament due to injury. Nadal, Djokovic, Djokovic has his own reasons. Alcaraz, there are certain tournaments where some of them just aren't there. And so I think there is opportunity, maybe more so on the men's side than the women's side, to maybe dodge some of the better players on the way to winning a Grand Slam title. Fatsis, your thoughts?
You're both winners in my book. I'm going to call it a draw. I think the men play 5 because the men play 5. I don't know, John, how much that actually should be a criterion. It's not like it's new. We've known that all along. Everybody's competing under the same circumstances.
It's harder to upset someone.
Absolutely. It's harder to upset someone, for sure. For sure. And it's also harder when the top of the tour has been dominated, as it has, by 3 people for those 20 years.
Alcaraz is just so effing good, too. All right. Thank you, John. Thank you, Stefan, for agreeing that I'm right. That is our show for today. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. To listen to past shows and subscribe or just reach out, go to slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. For Stefan Fatsis, I'm Josh Levin. Remember Zelmo Beatty, and thanks for listening.
Have you ever thought, ugh, this water is too wet?
Or this beach is too sandy? My name's Christine.
And my name is Zandy.
And we're the hosts of Beach Too Sandy, Water Too Wet, a podcast where we do dramatic readings of the most wild and off-the-wall reviews on the internet.
We find the funniest real reviews about everything from Vegas weddings, matchmaking services and Trader Joe's, to caves, toddler beds, and Spirit Halloween.
You won't believe the things that people think absolutely must be said on the internet. How else would everyone know that some caves don't have Wi-Fi?
We hear about the good, the bad, and that one time Spirit Halloween sent someone a dildo instead of a Halloween costume. And believe it or not, we got to the bottom of it.
Join us every Wednesday wherever you listen to your podcasts. Beach Too Sandy, Water Too Wet is brought to you by the Forever Dog Podcast Network.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Heidecker. You know me, Tim and Eric, Bridesmaids, and Fantastic Four. I'd like to personally invite you to listen to Office Hours Live with me and my co-hosts, DJ Doug Pound.
Hello.
And Vic Berger.
Howdy.
Every week we bring you laughs, fun, games, and lots of other surprises. It's live. We take your Zoom calls.
Music.
We love having fun. Excuse me?
Songs. Vic said something.
Songs.
Music.
I like having fun. I like to laugh. I like to to meet people who can make me laugh. Please subscribe now.